Hello Advanced Higher Historians and welcome to lesson 2 of our online lessons this time round. We are still talking about Stalin's economic policies and we have just finished discussing collectivization and we're now talking about the 5-year plans. Again, for this one, this is going to have quite a bit of textbook work on it, and then we're also going to be talking about an essay at the end, and your choice is between the collectivization essay or the 5-year plans essay. If you want to do both for essay practice, then that is fabulous and makes me very happy, but there is no expectation that you do both. You can pick one of the two that you think you could actually write best and do one or the other from these two, but you do have to do the notes and the tasks that go along with these PowerPoints so that everything makes sense. So that's kind of your task moving forward. So 5-year plans then we're looking at. Again, you should have this handout. If you don't, feel free just to use the video or use the version of it that's attached in the team. So learning intentions for this one. We're going to describe the modernisation of industry and the impact of this. We've looked at agriculture, we're now thinking about industry. Success criteria, you can explain what the 5-year plans actually were and you can make a judgment on the impact of these. So very similar to what we did in collectivisation. Reading assignment, you are between pages 206 to 218 so that you can see where these things kind of happen. Again, if you're not using a physical copy of the textbook because you don't have it for whatever reason, then use the digital copy that is on the team. So overview wise, the 5-year plans for industry were ambitious, and that is putting it lightly. They were quite far reaching and they were probably one of the examples of Stalin's kind of forceful ideal taking shape in Russia. They envisioned nothing less than the total transformation of the Soviet Union into a great modern industrial power. Central planning would replace the kind of capitalist market as the main device for managing the economy under the 5-year plans. The plans, however, soon hit problems as the central planning system found that it was not equipped to actually cope with the demands that it had imposed on itself, which is obviously an issue. And the first 5-year plan was marked by outrageous targets for industrial enterprises, suffering of workers because their needs were pushed right down to the bottom of the scale of priority, and just generally just a bad sense of living conditions within Russia at this point in time. Despite all of the problems, the plans were successful in quite a number of respects, and we're thinking about ultimately how successful these plans really were. So, industrialization, or the theory of central planning. Once the NEP had been reversed, all industry was owned and run by the state. Stalin was committed to the idea that detailed planning and rigorous enforcement of production targets could move the USSR forward massively in a 10-year period. What he introduced was Gosplan, which was the name given to the State Planning Committee. It was set up to kind of oversee this kind of central plan. How the central planning worked, 0.5 million planners in Gosplan worked out a very high set of 5-year production targets for every factory or industrial unit that exists in the USSR. They then backtracked from this kind of final target to produce annual targets over the 5-year period, which would increase year upon year as they kind of got better at the job that they were doing to reach this kind of final target that they had set. These targets, which were referred to as quotas, were the minimum standard that must be reached by every industrial unit and factory within the USSR over each of these years in the lead up to the 5-year mass target. Each worker in the factory or industrial unit was basically given a weekly norm, the amount of production that they were expected to produce, that then led to this target being met. And a way to kind of think about this is if you think about your target grading and the kind of learning conversations we have where we set your goal for what you need to do to get to this next stage and then how to get from there to the next stage. It's kind of the same sort of idea. ultimately, the grade you want at the end is this. So the grade that Russia wants at the end is going to be this thing. How are we going to get there? Right, here's what we're going to do at each point. So before the final exam part, this is what they're going to do. Before the kind of prelim, this is what they're going to do. At the start of the year, this is what they're going to do. And you've got this kind of really clear progression. And it gets kind of more difficult as you kind of go because you get better at what you're doing. Rewards and punishments being offered, obviously to try and encourage people. So workers who exceeded these norms received extra pay, more food, better housing conditions for them and their families. If you failed to reach those norms, you lost money, you lost food, and your housing could be taken away. So rewards and punishment being really cleverly kind of used to try as an incentive to get you to where you needed to get. So this is like me bringing cake if you do well in exams or assessments, for example. Okay, we are rewarding you for that with food. Workers who fail regularly or complain about their situation were dealt with by the OGPU, aka the secret police. They would just go away and disappear and off to a gulag with them. Generally, when it was actually announced, there was quite a bit of initial enthusiasm for the 5-year plans because it was being taken in by the people in a very, well, at least the propaganda was teaching them in a very patriotic kind of war sort of way. The language and things being used was all about them waging war against poverty, against backwardness, about striving to make Russia great and moving forward as a nation. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for this. It was really well orchestrated and really well targeted for these people. So the first 5-year plan, 1928 to sort of 1933 period, focused on heavy industry. So this is steelworks, ironworks, coal production, hydroelectric power, chemical production, motor vehicles, synthetic rubber, man-made fibres, electrical goods. Their target over the 5 years was a 300% increase in all these industries. Now that seems a bit ridiculous, but if you think about the fact that the pre-war levels is kind of like the basis where they were trying to get to at least, and then above that, it isn't actually that big in comparison to other countries. It is for Russia, but not for other countries. They're kind of trying to just get themselves on par with where they should have been had the war and all of the kind of 1914 onward stuff not really happened in Russia. They're just trying to get themselves back on track, basically. In addition, the necessary infrastructure that needed to kind of happen and be modernised to help with this needed to actually be set up. So this is talking about better road networks to transport goods, better railway networks that would allow goods to transport quickly and more efficiently, canals being used and things like that as well. Stalin was convinced that the military threat would be coming soon from the west and that these new industrial complexes needed to be prepared for that. So he would only locate them deep inside Russia to the east of the kind of Ural Mountains to try and prevent that from happening. The workers often faced terrible conditions. Many were peasants who had been displaced by collectivization, which we talked about, and they were basically doing piecework, which is just like small amounts of work with their hands, pays really, really, really low. They're only paid for the pieces of the materials or the goods or whatever they're making that actually can be used, and they're not paid for any of the ones that are not quite up to scratch or don't meet the standard, even if they've produced them and made them. So piecework rates were introduced 7 days a week. Despite the poor planning and the great loss of life in the first 5-year plans, it did achieve quite a great amount of progress. Industrial cities were actually built. The Moscow Underground was actually started. We saw pictures of both of these things in the introduction lesson to this topic, and it did actually mean that Russia made a huge step forward. Although many factory managers actually lied about their targets, about meeting them, because it was obviously not always possible to meet them, but they had to say that they did, there were really great strides forward in production. So even though they weren't always actually really meeting the targets, they were actually progressively getting better as time was going on. This meant that by 1932, Stalin was happy to announce to all of Russia that they had actually met the first 5-year plan and the final target for that in the space of 4 years. So they were actually ahead of themselves, which was a good thing for them. even though really the conditions were really horrible and there were people living in some really awful situations. The second 5-year plan, then introduced between 1933 and 1938, this set more realistic targets, although they were actually still quite highly demanding. They were kind of more achievable in a lot of ways. There was a growing fear at this point in time of the Nazi Party in Germany, so the focus of the plan kind of shifted slightly to become more about increasing the military strength and defence of Russia. The working and living conditions did remain quite poor across the second 5-year plans, but there were actually some small improvements overall. This plan also starts to see the appearance of Stakhovism, which is going to be important when we talk about that later on. This is kind of the idea that you could potentially be celebrated as a celebrity for the work that you did, and it comes from this guy, Alexei, who was a coal miner in the Donbass region between the 30th and the 31st of August 1935. He supposedly extracted 102 tons of coal by himself in a single 6-hour shift, which was 14 times the daily norm that he was supposed to actually do. He was hailed as a hero of the revolution, of course, and he and other people like him, extremely hardworking people, were grouped together as a kind of celebrity kind of sort of troupe that were then used as propaganda tours across the USSR. They were given, food and better housing conditions and the celebrity status. And they were used to inspire the workers. Now, because they were actually quite successful in this, it was seen as quite a successful thing, but they did also cause quite a bit of discontent. So the third 5-year plan then rolls round. Second one goes as well as the first one, and in 1938 to 41 you've got the third 5-year plan. Now, originally this plan was supposed to be focused on consumer goods within the USSR, but you've got this growing threat of war from Germany, so the emphasis changes to rearmament and armaments for Russia. June 1941, Germany invades the USSR and the plan ends because of that, so it doesn't quite get to its full amount of time. If we are actually evaluating the 5-year plans, despite the difficulty of actually trusting the figures, because remember we're always not really trusting figures that come from Russia at this point, it is clear that the USSR's industrial production increased massively, and economically that had a huge impact. They achieved their industrial growth without foreign investment, and that meant that when the Wall Street crash happened and the world recession happened in the 30s, Russia was actually almost immune from this. However, the human cost of life on this was actually massive. There had not been an equivalent increase in the living standards of the Russian people as there was with the industrial growth, and this meant that the conditions were actually still really poor. Overcrowding was really common, overwork was really common, starvation was common, disease spreading and things like that was not actually being tackled. So the human cost actually was particularly high. And I'm not just say see the handout there, but you do have kind of an evaluation on the 5-year plans that you can have a look at in your own time when this kind of bit's finished off. So, textbook work then for this section of the topic. You've got a couple of headings there and the pages that link with them. Basically what I want you to do is use the headings and just take some bullet points underneath each one. So how were the 5-year plans organised? What did they achieve? How did the workers fare in particular? Because we're going to think about that for the essay. Did the urban standards improve during the plans? And ultimately, how successful were the 5-year plans? So you're working through the chapter, taking notes under each of the headings and any historiography points and tasks that you can see you're completing as you go with this. So summary wise, in terms of the 5-year plans, the party was convinced that the route to socialism was through urbanisation and the proletarianation of the Russian people. Although this was a revolution from above. There was a great deal of support. So it's not an armed revolution, it's an economic revolution. There was a great deal of support of this for the plans and for socialist sort of construction from the young urban workers. The changes were administered through the command economy, which relied on the Central Planning Committee and Gosplan. The mechanism chosen was the 5-year plans, which set out these targets. It was really ambitious, and there was huge effort, and it wasn't so much because of it was rational and it made sense, it was more because the propaganda inspired the people. A lot of the targets in the plans meant that people were falsifying the numbers, and it led to kind of corruption within that. The first 5-year plan was chaotic. There was a lot of waste, and a lot of the products were then undertaken as a result of that. Some workers did quite well, especially the skilled ones, but others, particularly the ex-peasants who were forced by collectivisation to be in the cities, found themselves in what was referred to as a quicksand society. So they were trying to make a better living and avoid the harsh punishments by constantly moving from place to place and job to job, but it meant there was no standard of living really for them and no security of job or work or life. The second 5-year plan saw more development planning and more reasonable targets, and the workers enjoyed 3 quite good years with more food, more consumer goods, but then the purges happened and these ended them. The third plan saw a return to the shortages and the chaotic planning as the first one did, because the resources were then being diverted to military ideal. Generally, the standard of living for most workers during the plans was poor, and it improved very marginally. The housing standards remained really awful. So, go back and do the textbook bits, pause it if you want to, or do it when you're done, and we're now going to move on to think about what the essay that connects to this would be. So the question is, to what extent did ideology bring about the 5-year plans? So why did the 5-year plans occur, and to what extent was it ideology that brought it about? So for this one, you have to think about what the aims of the 5-year plans actually were. We've got ideology aims, we've got economic or sort of practical aims, and we've got the desire to maintain control. So these would be what your paragraphs would be talking about. Remember, named factor first. In your introduction, remember we're given context, addressing the question, your overview of your historiography, schools of thought, and your key issues or factors you're going to discuss, as well as your line of argument. So I've given you another introduction. We've kind of just used the same start off point and just tweaked it slightly from the collectivisation essay and given a wee bit of information there, so you can use this as your introduction or you can write your own, but there's there to kind of help support you a bit. Okay, so you should remember to aim to look at these 3 factors that we're talking about, so ideology, the economic sort of points, and the desire for control. Remember factor sentences to make it really clear what you're talking about. For FIDO, your information, which is your debate, your KU, your debate, which is your analysis and your analysis plus, and then your historiography, which is your H in FIDO, and then your overall for your evaluation. And again, I can't emphasise enough that your evaluation should not be a repeat of your information from anywhere else. It should be your points that you're using to kind of back up your argument that you haven't already used. So it needs to be new information. So a little bit of kind of help for evidence-wise for you for this in terms of ideology. It was kind of to honour the legacy of Lenin. So this was a true Leninist course, the path that Lenin himself would have followed had he lived, okay, which is from Stalin himself. He argues that this is the way forward Lenin would have wanted. It was to achieve socialism in one country, to create an economy that was bound by the teaching of Marx, to create an urban socialised proletariat group. So ideology, these are the things that they were trying to do. Lenin emphasised industrialization. He said it was necessary as a keystone for the stabilisation of the dictatorship of the proletariat, okay, which comes from historian Knickerbocker. Stalin appeared to continue with this because of his focus on rapid industrialisation. So again, this ideal of him being the disciple of Lenin and doing that way. Yet, Medvedev argues that Stalin was employing mainly administrative rather than economic methods to carry out industrialization. Stalin acted not in line with Lenin's clear instructions, but in defiance of them. So maybe against this idea of it being an ideology thing. This suggests that Lenin was not being followed as far as Stalin was concerned. Okay, the idea of socialism in one country requires a highly industrialised state with a large urban population, yet 1928 only 20% of the Soviet population were actually urban workers, corn and fine. So it appears that Stalin's focus on industrialisation was a real attempt to actually change this. So Stalin turned industrialisation into a heroic crusade to ensure the survival of communism. And that's been quoted by Chris Ward. However, Stalin allowed socialist competition to motivate the workers, which contradicted Marx's teachings and disagrees with, obviously, the element of competition. By eliminating the kulaks, he also got rid of the most efficient, hard-working farmers, so this would be an indication that ideology to create this amazing workforce and things is not actually the key part. Economic or practical kind of aims for him. Regarding the Western countries and Russia at this point in time, all beat her because of her backwardness, because of her military backwardness, cultural backwardness, political backwardness. We are 50 years behind the advanced countries. We must make the distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall go under. So Stalin quoting that, showing that economically and practically he was doing it to maybe save Russia, to improve the Russian economy. Also, unhappiness with the NEP was not acceptable for a communist state in the long term, so maybe it was working to kind of Stalin's advantage because he could criticise that policy. It was only supposed to be a temporary measure anyway, so is economically and practically this the way forward they would have taken anyway? The war scare was used by Stalin to kind of show that this was necessary, and it would basically help with the aim of kind of earning foreign currency for capital equipment. So it was practical by nature. It was about getting rid of NEP and about moving forward from there and about industrialising. In terms of the desire to maintain control, the failings of the NEP and unpopularity within the party of its kind of halfway solutions were not kind of compatible with the socialist society, but it also gave a useful excuse for practical measures to break the peasant stranglehold on the economy. By eliminating the kulaks, it was a practical measure, it was an ideological sort of reasoning. It claimed that the kulaks were not adhering to the communist values, but it was a means of controlling the countryside. God's plan set the targets. So God's plan's control figures, intended as predictors for economic performance, marked an important step on the road to full-scale planning. It was the first attempt at central planning committees. That's from Chris Ward. It allowed Stalin to basically feed material and figures to the Russians that put him in a positive light as well, so that allowed him to keep control over all of Russia. Wildly optimistic figures were published and targets continuously raised. The figures were not challenged because Stalin was in total control and the people were behind the notion of self-sufficient Russia that he was trying to do. So basically they were trying to compete on this world stage, so they listened to what Stalin had to say here. To the majority of people, socialism in the USSR afforded the means to acquire a niche as well as a sense of pride. And that's from another historian talking about Stalin and his way forward. Thousands of young people in particular participated in the great construction projects of socialism with a will to self-sacrifice, accepting hardship with a real sense of comrade. That's from Nove, great historian on this topic in general. So using that evidence to support your arguments, and then would be thinking about conclusions. So obviously writing a good conclusion is essential. You want again to summarise your main arguments. Many conclusions in your evaluation, you use that to kind of support it, and then we're looking for you to come to a definitive answer. So 2 essays for you to choose from. collectivisation or 5-year plans. You can do both if you wish, or pick one or the other, but decide which one that you are going to do. Obviously, do the tasks that go with this particular lesson, and then decide which of the essays that you're going to do as your assignment, and just let me know in the team which one you're choosing, and then we will obviously put the deadline and things into the assignment.